Hello. So I'm sort of amalgamating two stories here, but they are related. So it makes sense to put them in one video. Yesterday, or probably would have been the night before, there were serious riots in Bristol. Um, and this was part of a protest called Kill the Bill. Now, as always with these sort of situations, it's a case where there were peaceful people and then there's also violent people. I'm not going to get into the realm of the majority where the minority went or something like that because I wasn't there. But clearly there was serious disorder. Seven arrests were made. Several police officers were seriously injured. I'm surprised it's only seven, in fact, given the extent of the trouble. Apparently, it's the worst riot in Bristol for decades, and that's saying something because Bristol is a city, somewhat more so than others, that has a long history of riots and protests. There's an entire Wikipedia article on this that you don't necessarily get with other cities. Of course, any big British city will have its share of disruption, but Bristol seems to be. I don't know what the reason for that is. Maybe it's the fact that it's a port city, so traditionally there was. Well, I don't know. I don't even know where I'm going with that, but who knows? There's a lot of factors for it. Might actually be because historically Bristol was a wealthy city on one hand, of course, from the slave trade, but it also had pockets of serious poverty, so there might have been a big gap in that sense. I don't know. It's had its share of racial tension. It's had a lot of protests over the years. Firstly, the left and the right would take perspectives on this. I haven't seen many people condoning the violence. The left are going to say, well, this is just playing into Priti Patel's hands. It's giving her the powers that she wants to have for this crime bill and kind of proving her point. Or they wouldn't see it that way, but they'll say it's going into her hands. Now, the right, more conservative people might say, well, this just proves the need for this bill because the irony of using violence to protest a bill that is designed to stop violence at protests, is obvious. I've said before, any new legislation does need to be heavily scrutinized, but I've seen people comparing this crime bill, this police powers bill, to China, like saying we're becoming a police state and it's becoming more and more like China. There are areas in our society that are getting more authoritarian and do require serious scrutiny. I would argue hate crime bills, for example, the one that's been passed in Scotland and how that is utilised. I think there are very serious concerns over how that will trample free speech. However, this idea that doing something about the aggressive tactics of the likes of Extinction Rebellion somehow amounts to us becoming a police state is absurd. And it's absurd for several reasons. Firstly, Extinction Rebellion activists are not being sent to re education camps. Okay? Secondly, the majority of the public do not support their tactics. A typical Extinction Rebellion argument goes as follows. They say, well, our tactics work because it's in the media. They're ignoring the fact that the coverage isn't about climate change. The coverage is about their moronic tactics. It's something they don't seem to grasp. I do think they're very egotistical and blind to any sort of dissenting views. They're in their little bubble of we're right, everyone else is wrong, and that's it. Because, of course, we're all ignorant fools. It's only Extinction Rebellion that knows about climate change. The rest of us are just, you know, living in this dream where we don't understand the issues and we don't care because they're the only ones that care apparently. So I think they're very self-righteous, but the tactics, this is an important point. They often say they're peaceful protests. Well, it's important to define that. Um, there are some who argue, like Mark Wallace in the Eye the other day, the chairman of Conservative Home, and he had somewhat nuanced view on this, but the argument is, well, protest by nature is disruptive. But I maintain that throughout history, and I'm reiterating some of the things I said in the previous video, but I think this is important. No movement has succeeded without getting wider support. I would argue that the suffragette movement did not succeed because more militant suffragettes were bombing homes and endangering life in some cases. All that done was angered more men or solidify more men and men and women for that matter against them. I think it's more likely that the suffragette movement succeeded for a range of factors. One of them was that the domestic situation changed. Women were taking more and more roles that were usually held by men because of the war effort. World War One had an enormous transformative power on society. Both world wars did, but especially World War One, in terms of galvanizing women's role in the workplace. I would argue things like that played a bigger role because women rightly argued, well, we've done our part for the war effort. Now we should have equal rights to men. Um, I think that was much more of a factor in the more militant tactics. Of course, I'm not a sociologist. You can look at that a lot of different ways, but I'm not convinced that suffragettes bombing MPs' homes is what turned the movement. Um, and with the civil rights movement, I think it was the police brutality at Selma more than other tactics that helped to galvanize the wider public. Sit-ins and so on had their place, and I guess they were disruptive, but they were opposing immoral laws. Now, with Extinction Rebellion, they like to compare themselves to these sort of historic movements, but I think there are differences. Overwhelming majority of the public do not support them. Whereas with the civil rights movement, certainly by the mid 60s, more and more people were supporting it. That's a fundamental difference. Look at Extinction Rebellion's membership. At most, it's perhaps 300,000 in a country of 68 million. So I am not convinced that they have this overwhelming public support that they seem to think they have. Um, that matters because if you don't get the public on side, you're doomed to failure. They think that more media attention is a good thing, but it's negative attention. Tearing up a green at Cambridge University isn't going to save a single polar bear. Gluing yourself to a building in London isn't going to stop icebergs melting. Throwing red paints over public buildings, just sheer vandalism, or disrupting commuters isn't going to stop Bangladeshi fishermen from being caught up in powerful cyclones. So I do think it's very egotistical. And then there's that kind of cult-like thing within them, those women that wear the red, they look like Venetian dramatists. I mean, what's that all about? This is weird. Um, so I have a very low opinion of Extinction Rebellion. I think that they are arrogant. I think they're self-righteous. And I think they're deluded. Um, I mean, honestly, I would look at what have they actually changed. I am not convinced that those protests have changed a single government policy. If the government has done more on climate change, it won't be because of Extinction Rebellion. It will be because of the evidence and because they're acting on scientific advice, hopefully. You could argue they could do more, but I think progress has been made. I'm not a climate denier. I think there are very real issues at stake here. But one reason I dislike Extinction Rebellion is rather than drawing attention to the issue, they're actually overshadowing the issue. That's another reason that I think Extinction Rebellion is more of a problem than the solution. Um, so these new crime bills, you cannot have a situation where the minority trumps the right of the majority. And again, this is tying into what I said before. That is not becoming more China-like. That is just respecting the will of the majority. The majority of people do not want to be disrupted by these activists. Even I know people who are on the centre left who are very passionate about green issues and they're not comfortable with Extinction Rebellion. There's a reason for that. So this isn't just reactionary conservatives who are in the oil business who are against him. It's the majority of people, from what I can tell. Sure, there are people that support them, but I would say that they haven't been directly impacted by them. I think they would maybe change their tune if they, for example, miss a job interview or miss visiting a relative in hospital, which of course at the moment is extremely restricted anyway. Um, Extinction Rebellion has largely stayed within the law during the lockdown phase, which is one of the few good things they have done or sensible things they've done. I think if Extinction Rebellion was to cause disruption, whilst people are already going through stress and sacrifice because of this pandemic, I think the public would be unforgiving. I think the anger against Extinction Rebellion would hit a new level. Um, so if you're an XR activist and you're thinking, oh, but it's about climate change, stop lying to yourself. Maybe you think it is, and maybe you genuinely care about those issues. For what it's worth, I do think a lot of the activists probably think that is what it's about. But I honestly think it's more an anarchist movement. I don't think they really want to make change. Because if they did, they would be doing what works. They would be getting the public on side. They're not doing that. Um, I mean, targeting the tube, for example, is comparatively one of the cleanest forms of transport. So that just counters their own argument. And I know they will say, oh, but that wasn't all of it, that was one chapter. Well, that's the problem. If you don't have some sort of leadership, if you don't have some sort of organization, then every action, I mean, Roger Hallam has created Frankenstein's monster with this, him and the other co-founders, because on one hand, they make these outrageous sort of statements like we need to overthrow governments, and then they try to wash their hands of it when anarchy does happen. So I have little respect for them either because I don't think they're willing to take responsibility um, for what they have caused, or at least what they have influenced. Right, I'll wrap it up there. In summary, of course, any new bill needs to be scrutinised. Of course, police power is a major issue. I certainly wouldn't be one for advocating unlimited police power. You know, that's something that whether you're right, left, or centre, there needs to be concern about. There are definitely times when the police abuse their power, but I think the wider public would support more actions against the likes of Extinction Rebellion on the grounds that Extinction Rebellion are hurting the public. This line, oh, it's peaceful protest. Vandalism is not peaceful. Causing deliberate stress to ordinary people is not peaceful. That's an aggressive act. So just because Extinction Rebellion activists aren't, throwing Molotov cocktails at police or punching people doesn't automatically mean they're peaceful and okay. Disruption and aggression isn't just about violence. If this bill was like saying let's ban all protests indeterminately for good, then I would say, well, that's very dangerous. That is China-esque, but that's not what it is doing. I think this is a government response to the increasingly fed up public. Um, as for the kill the bill thing, that was counterproductive. All that done was play into the argument that the police need to be more aggressive in their tactics. I don't think they do, but it was totally counterproductive.